The United States and North Korea have resumed direct talks in Beijing, meeting for the first time since the death of Kim Jong Il. And while warlike rhetoric continues to flow from Pyongyang, there's a modicum of optimism that the new regime may be more stable than we'd first feared. So, what are the prospects? Welcome to Agenda, and to discuss the outlook for the Korean Peninsula in the months ahead are Stratfor senior analysts Nate Hughes and Rodger Baker. Rodger, can I ask you first how you see political and economic stability given recent moves by China to invest more in North Korea?
I think as we look at North Korea, one of the things that we're seeing is a linkage between the political stability and the economic stability. Before Kim Jong Il died, he was laying in a path to create a smooth transition for his son. That involved a couple of things. One, it was the intent to stay alive during the transition so that he could work from behind the scenes to manage the various elite factions in North Korea. Another aspect of that was to increase the funding coming into North Korea so that he had a bigger pie to share with all of the different elements of the elite during this transition time. So the Chinese deal really fits into that. It was something that was struck before Kim Jong Il died. It's not necessarily a new move by the Chinese. From the Chinese perspective, it allows more regime stability in the north, something they want. From the North Korean perspective, at least in the short term, it gives them an extra amount of cash that they can use to share power. One of the things that we see when they're trying to share power internally then is a way to balance between the military and the civilian elements of the government. And while North Korea is considered largely a military state, what we saw Kim Jong Il doing was trying to reinvigorate the Workers' Party of Korea, reinvigorate the role of the premier and the cabinet, so that it would counterbalance to some extent the overwhelming influence of the military. Those paths weren't completely done by the time he died. We're still seeing that balance trying to be reshaped. And in particular, we're seeing a military that may be trying to find ways to ensure that it retains a much stronger role and a much stronger hold over funding, internal distribution of resources. And that means it's a military that may want to try some minor provocations.
This work in progress, as you put it, continues without disruption.
I think certainly what we're seeing is a continuation. We're seeing the way in which the regime is still working out its own problems. And this is going to take a while. With Kim Jong Il, it took 3, almost 4 years before he had sort of re-solidified power. And that was after years of being known he was going to be in there. For Kim Jong-un, this is going to be a much harder change.
Of course, there are tensions. Only this week, South Korea staged a live-fire military exercise around a string of islands whose possession is contested by the North, and has said it's prepared for total war. So this rhetoric continues, but not much more. Is this a good sign?
The United States and South Korea independently will continue to conduct military exercises as a routine part of maintaining their capability and postures. The real question is there any additional provocation from the North, not just as certain factions maneuver around each other in Pyongyang, but also as the U.S. begins to rebalance its posture in the entire Pacific region as it withdraws from Afghanistan in the years ahead. China has a great deal of incentive to push back, and one of those levers that it has to bring to bear is its leverage over North Korea. So there's a number of incentives and a lot of things in play that mean that some further instability is certainly a potential.
I think as we look at that too, though, you also have to take into consideration the Chinese have a balance in which to walk. So if I'm the Chinese, what I'm looking at is saying, yes, I want a certain amount maybe of provocation from the North, but if it goes too far, rather than perhaps discourage some of the changes in the U.S. Military restructuring in the region, it may encourage the U.S. to come in with a stronger hand. The same question goes for the North Koreans as they're looking at how far they're willing to push provocation. After the Cheonan incident and Yeonpyeong-do, the South Koreans have made it very clear that another large-scale incident by the North Koreans would lead to a retaliatory strike by the South Koreans, probably airstrikes, artillery strikes. And that puts into the North Korean camp a very difficult decision, and that is, do they then escalate from there, or do they pull back if pulling back undermines their own domestic constituency, their domestic strength, they can't do that. If they push forward, they can push too far forward. You can head into a much broader element of confrontation, and that could undermine stability and undermine their ability to hold their own regime together.
And with so much at play in Pyongyang behind the scenes, there's considerable room for miscalculation in terms of one side's perception of how the other will respond and how it actually does.
Rodger, while China has obviously got to sustain North Korea, it also has to bear in mind that South Korea is its fourth largest trading partner.
The Chinese, I think, are careful to balance between the two. Where it comes into play really is where it hits domestic South Korean politics. And that's something we're seeing right now. We're watching this issue of North Korean defectors moving across into China, China repatriating them to North Korea. The South Korean leadership is heading towards elections. They have to take a stronger stance now on protecting the North, protecting North Korean human rights issues. And so they're having to confront China at this time. And this leaves the Chinese in a difficult situation. They don't want to accept this flood or heavy stream of North Koreans moving across the border into China. Neither do they want to really undermine the political and potentially economic relations with the South.
Also, that points to a real desire for stability from at least two and probably more players in this.
I think in general, all the parties would like to see a reduction in tensions, would like to see a certain amount of stability. There's some benefits for the North, for example, in some cases to increase tension as part of a negotiation process or as part of a way to balance relations around them. But I think as we see the leadership transitions going on throughout the region, as we see domestic politics starting to take a stronger role, there's a lot of room, as Nate said, for miscalculation, miscommunication, and that can quickly lead to escalation.
And Nate, we now have a number of troops in North Korea to recover the remains of American soldiers killed in the Korean War. What kind of intelligence are we picking up from that?
The United States has found direct military-to-military relationships over the years to be very useful. The best recent example is the U.S. military's relationship with the Egyptian military during the tensions with the Mubarak regime in Cairo last year. This is a much more low-level interaction that we're seeing with the North right now in terms of repatriating remains from the Korean War. What it does do is get U.S. personnel inside the country where a lot of anecdotal evidence, at least, and intelligence can be collected. This will be very limited and very carefully controlled. But nevertheless, North Korea has over the years become a very closed-off country, even much of their communication taking place over landlines, so that any additional perspective about what's going on in the interior of North Korea is always valuable.
So, Rodger, summing up, when Kim died, many commentators were fearful, but maybe it's possible to be more positive now.
I think that the expectations of the worst come every time there's an element of crisis in North Korea. You have to look at North Korea not as being led by a single individual. It's not. Kim Jong Il did not run North Korea. Kim Jong Il sat in a position to balance out a set of elite elements who each played a very strong role and had a strong interest in maintaining this specific political, social structure in North Korea for their own benefit. That hasn't changed with his death. What's changed is that the single individual who had spent years learning the different elements, using his own skills, using gifts and using punishments to keep that in balance is no longer there. We have new people trying to keep that in balance. And that leaves a fair amount of space for some problems, for some errors, for confrontations, for people being lined up on the hill and shot, but also opportunities for new elements to emerge within the North Korean elite over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, that may have a very different interest in where North Korea goes in the future or how willing North Korea is to change some of its, for example, economic policies or international relations.
And we know Kim Jong-un is not quite as immature or inexperienced as some would have us believe. He was at least part educated in Europe, and apparently when he went to Russia recently insisted on having satellite internet installed 24/7 on his train.
I think the North Koreans have perpetuated a myth over time of being strange. It allows them to keep their competitors off balance. The mystery is good for them. but they're much more savvy than they appear internationally. I think that Kim Jong Un has, as a representative really of this third generation of North Korean leadership, he has Western training, he has Western education, he has a fairly good concept of Western ideas. And it doesn't mean that he has an intent to come in and change North Korea to fit a Western pattern, but he's much more aware of the way in which the outside world works. And I think many of this next generation of leadership coming in have this same awareness, and that gives them the space to adjust their policies in a way that both keeps them in charge, keeps their elite structure in place, but also opens North Korea up to some changes in its economic position and maybe even some of its social policies.
And there's one aspect of that that's, from a military perspective, is the very careful and deliberate crisis escalation and de-escalation that these military exercises and gestures and sporadic attacks can serve a purpose for, in terms of manipulating the international community diplomatically and politically. So that's also something to keep in mind when we look at the prospects for military activity in the region moving forward.
Nate and Rodger, thanks for that analysis. And that's Agenda for this week. I'm Colin Chapman. Thanks very much for joining me. And until the next time, goodbye.